Hi everyone, and welcome to mini lecture 6. Today we'll discuss colons and semicolons. Before we begin, take a moment to gather the following materials for the lecture assignment. Today's lecture assignment will be more of a reflection, so you'll just need a Word document to write on, and you will not need access to any of our any drafting materials for our current project. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the purpose for colons, next we'll define the purpose of semicolons, and finally we'll understand the rhetorical contributions of both. All right, so let's first start with a colon. The eyes of an emoticon smiley face. So the purpose of a colon is that it signals the phrase that is to say, as follows, or here's what I mean, without actually saying that to your reader. So you can see already how the colon can help you tighten up, the space that you've got. So let's say, you can only write one page. And if that's the case, perhaps, using the phrase that is to say, or here's what I mean, maybe that just takes up too much room, and you can replace all of those characters and spaces with just 2 dots, pretty much. Anyone who's on Twitter, you know the importance of getting the best bang for your buck in terms of using the correct characters, and sometimes those are words, and sometimes those are just punctuation marks. And so if you do find yourself in your text basically saying or signaling to your reader, okay, here's what I mean, or that is to say, then you can consider using a colon. One thing that's important to remember, though, with colons is that they should be preceded by a complete sentence or an independent clause. So an actor should be performing an action, and this can be in a sense of an active or a passive verb. You can either use an active or a passive verb. It doesn't matter which, just as long as there is an independent clause before you use the colon. So let's look at a couple of examples. I would like these items from the office supply store, colon, paper clips, dry erase markers, and legal pads. And so this basically says, I would like these items from the office store as follows, or that is to say, paper clips, dry erase markers, and legal pads. The next example reads, Ralph Waldo Emerson left readers with a wonderful quote on happiness, colon, for every 5 minutes you are angry, or for every minute you are angry, you lose 60 seconds of happiness. So we could, in a way, replace it with Ralph Waldo Emerson left readers with a wonderful quote on happiness. That is to say, for every minute you are angry, or a wonderful quote on happiness as follows, for every minute. But if you want to create, we can, in a rhetorical sense, we often use colons if we want to equally express or emphasize both sides of what's on the colon. And even though what is on the right side, so like the quote and the list that we see here, even though they are both dependent clauses, they still, as content, should be emphasized, because if you're going to the office supply store, you're going to need to know what to buy. Or if you are stressing a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote, you're going to want to include the quote and emphasize the quote and put sort of an equal emphasis on the quote, much again like you would if you were going to the office supply store and you needed to know what to buy. So a colon, rhetorically speaking, can be used if you sort of just want both sides to sit equal balance on the sentence scale, but just make sure that you have a complete sentence, an independent clause coming before the colon. The next that we'll want to look at will be semicolons. Now, semicolons can do quite a bit, and I think they're great, and when they are used properly, they can allow writers to just go off on, develop these wonderfully long sentences that clearly still articulate one single meaning, but it allows writers to weave ideas together, concepts together in a way that a comma or a period would not. So a semicolon separates independent clauses without a conjunction, but they can also separate larger items in a list. These are similar to periods, but certainly not interchangeable with one. It indicates there is a relationship between the sentences. So now with a period, that basically, you're indicating to the reader, that's that thought, this is this thought, they're totally different things. But when you incorporate a semicolon, even if, you just leave it as a semicolon, or if you include a conjunction or a transition word, it tells the reader, it is a visual cue to the reader. There is a relationship between these two ideas. Yes, they are complete thoughts, but they are connected. They are intended to create some kind of dialogue or foster some kind of thought regarding the ideas they're communicating. So if we look at these examples here, the TV show Brooklyn Nine-Nine was canceled by Fox, semicolon. It was soon picked up by ABC. So that indicates kind of this cause and effect type relationship. So Brooklyn Nine-Nine was canceled by Fox. It was soon picked up by ABC. Maybe I am writing a piece on how it was a good opportunity for ABC, or maybe I'm talking about how it was a bad decision for Fox to cancel Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And so by having that semicolon there, rather than making these two independent clauses their own sentences, but rather by joining them with a semicolon, I'm indicating to the reader, hey, I'm getting at, there's a meaning behind the relationship between these two sentences. And probably in your text that follows, you'd unpack that relationship. We can also see in the next example what a semicolon looks like when paired with a transition word. I originally planned to take Math 1050 at 9 a.m. Semicolon, however, I took the class at 10 a.m. So we can see here that a semicolon works perfectly fine on its own. It does. But if we want to further establish the relationship between the two sentences, we can include a transition there. And with a semicolon, that is not inappropriate or misplaced in any way. So typically, especially in academic writing, you'll see semicolon, however, semicolon, nevertheless, semicolon, in addition to. Something along those lines. And so, like I said, semicolons can do a lot. And so they are primarily just really great at both separating but also kind of bringing together those independent clauses without a conjunction. But if you want to include one, you certainly can, and you have the flexibility to do that. Now, when we think about separating larger items in a list, as we discuss in the mini lecture on commas, whenever we write, a city and a state, or if we include month, day, year for listing dates, we have to include commas in there. Now, items in a series are typically separated with a comma, but if I'm saying something like St. George, comma, Utah, or let's say if I was writing the sentence, I have visited the following place, I went to the following places over the summer. St. George, Utah, St. George, comma, Utah, comma, Las Vegas, comma, Nevada, comma, Burbank, comma, California. That's a lot of commas. And so what a semicolon can do in this instance is it can say, okay, where's the comma necessary? The comma is necessary in between the city and the state. No worries, because where those commas currently are to separate those different locations, I can just take over. So we see in this example, throughout my life, I've lived in San Francisco, comma, California, semicolon, Oklahoma City, comma, Oklahoma, semicolon, and Salt Lake City, comma, Utah, period. And so the same can be said for dates, or maybe you're listing off several different lists. So I went to the store, I went shopping today and bought milk, eggs, and butter, semicolon, movies, video games, and books, semicolon, paper, pens, and pencils. And so you can see how each one of those lists, you would separate those individual items with a comma, but we've got different lists there. And so we can indicate that those are different lists by separating them with a semicolon. All right, so for the lecture assignment, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to reflect on your experiences with colons and semicolons. And I'd like you to compose a brief write-up about 75 words discussing the following: your prior understanding and use of both semicolons and colons, and your predictions for how understanding semicolons and colons will aid in your writing. So if you're like me and didn't really understand how semicolons and colons were used, up until like high school or even after that, that's totally fine. And honesty is key, especially in reflection writing like this. So, you can say, hey, I've always understood semicolons, but colons have always been a little muddy for me, or vice versa. Or maybe you could say, I've never really understood the purpose of them, or maybe you have a really firm understanding of both of them. But regardless of where you're at, just reflect critically and honestly about your understandings and use in the past. And then talk about how this lecture and the rules that we discussed and the functions that we discussed will help you in your writing. So you could say, okay, well, now that I know that I can use a semicolon to connect two independent clauses, but still emphasize how they are complete separate ideas, I think will help me better establish relationships among different parts of my analysis that I'm working on, or it'll help me, in the discussion posts in this way. So, now that we have talked about semicolons and colons, if you have any questions or if I can speak to any of these concepts in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me. All right, everyone, until next time.